We're right at the top of the hour now. Welcome to today's webinar on 7 must-dos to expedite FedRamp for containers. My name is Kim Wines with Encore, and I'll be your moderator here today. While we're waiting for everybody to join, let's go through a few housekeeping items. The first thing to note is you guys are all muted, which you've probably noticed. But we will be doing a Q&A at the end. So as we go through the webinar, there is a questions panel. You can feel free to enter your questions at any time during the webinar, and then we'll be looking at those questions when we get to the end and asking those of our speakers for today. Also, the most common question is, will I get the slides from today? You will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording. If you also would like an actual copy of the slides, just feel free to put a question in the question panel and we can arrange that as well. And once the webinar is concluded, there will be a short 3-question feedback survey at the end. We'd really encourage you to take it because we'd like to get your feedback on how we did today and what we can do better in the future. So that would be great if you can participate in that. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So just for those of you, many of you may know who Encore is, but for some of those who may not, I'll give you the 5-second commercial here, which is that Encore is focused on helping organizations to secure their cloud-native software supply chain. So many organizations are now developing cloud-native applications that are typically built using containers, and using these new DevOps and DevSecOps processes, they're needing to embed continuous security and compliance into the development process so that they can find issues, security issues earlier, fix them more quickly and more easily and at lower cost, as opposed to waiting till security issues show up in production. So that's a little bit about Encore, and of course you can find out more about us on our website. So let's go on to the next slide. Our agenda for today is we're going to talk a little bit about the latest FedRamp requirements for containers. So many of you may know that a couple of weeks ago, FedRamp released a new guidance document or set of requirements for containers that are additive to existing FedRamp's controls. So we're going to be talking both about how do you take into account the existing FedRamp controls for containerized applications, and what are the things you need to watch out for in these new requirements, give you a little bit of a deeper dive and a view and a little bit of advice on how to handle them, and then talk a little bit about your transition plan. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So I want to do a quick few polling questions while everybody's still joining. This allows you to get to know each other and us to get to know you a little bit. So we're going to have 3 questions. So the first one is whether you currently have applications that already have FedRamp authorization, or you can see there's an option here if you don't have any today, but you have some in process or are planning to. So select the one that's relevant to your organization, and I'm going to give people a few seconds here to get their option picked. All right, last few seconds here if you want to get in on the poll. All right, I'm going to close the poll and then I'm going to share the results with everybody. So 12% of you have multiple applications. 24% are in process, so obviously this is important. 47% don't, but are planning to, and then 18% are just here, I guess, for more information, have no current plans to do anything with FedRamp. All right, thank you for that. So let's go on to a second question, which is whether you are using containers in the applications you FedRamp. And for those of you that are planning this but aren't doing it today, you know, base it on the applications you're planning to FedRamp. So whether all of those applications use containers, whether some of the applications you FedRamp or will FedRamp are using containers, whether you're not using containers right now but planning to, or you have no plans at all. So let's give you another second or two to get your answers in. Great. And I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results with you. So a quarter of you are using containers across the board. About half are using it in at least some of your applications. And then the rest of you, not today, but planning to, or no plans at all. Great, thank you for that. And one final question, really relating to the actual FedRamp process. So given that there are these new container requirements, where are you in complying? Do you already comply? Are you in the process of implementing it? Are you still evaluating the requirements, trying to understand them, not sure, or do you think it's not applicable to you? This is set up as a checkbox, but I think the answers are such you probably only need to pick one that's relevant to you. Again, I'll give you another second or so to answer, and I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results with you. So 7% of you are ahead of the game, already comply. Great to hear that. 20% are in process. 80% are still evaluating. So hopefully today will help you get a little bit further. And we do have some information about the timelines that you guys are probably aware of, and then the rest not sure or not applicable. Great, thank you so much for sharing that. All right, so with that, let's go on to our next slide. And I just want to highlight that these new requirements were released on March 16th was the publication date. This was just a link to an article, as well as you can see the actual document itself. These are supplemental, so the existing FedRamp controls are still in place, but this is sort of extra guidance around that. We'll talk through that in a moment. But there is a 6-month deadline to transition into full compliance. So that means the key date here is September 16th, when you would need to be in full compliance, and a 1-month timeline to provide a transition plan. All right, let me go on to the next slide. I want to introduce our 2 presenters today because I'm going to be handing it over to them. The first presenter you're going to hear from today is Jeremy Valance, who's a research engineer in our Office of the CTO here at Ancor. So you'll hear from him first, and then you'll hear from Hayden Smith, who's a senior DevSecOps engineer focused on the public sector, is also somebody that has been a FedRamp assessor in previous lives, so is well-versed in all the ins and outs of FedRamp. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Jeremy.
Thank you, Kim. So hi, everybody. My name is Jeremy Valance. And as Kim mentioned, I'm a research engineer within our CTO office here at Ancor. The plan is not for this to kind of do a real deep dive into kind of the end-to-end authorization process. There are plenty of good resources out there, particularly kind of the FedRamp site, that go into those details, and I think that information is good enough to kind of go in and research on your own. Really, what I want to kind of focus on a little bit is not only that kind of security guide that Kim just mentioned, but also some of the things that Ancor can do to help address the items in that guide in particular. So just to very quickly level set on FedRamp itself, it's a government-wide program that provides a standardized approach to the security assessment and authorization and continuous monitoring for cloud products and services, right? And before FedRamp, the authorization process was different from agency to agency. So the whole objective of FedRamp really was to kind of provide this natural guiding framework for all these security controls for folks who wanted to kind of do business with various federal agencies. Their guiding principle ultimately is to enable reuse, right? It became very inefficient to go from agency to agency with all these different types of security controls. So FedRamp's real objective seeks to simplify that whole end-to-end flow. Stepping back a little bit, I think this is kind of important context. So there are a significant number of kind of common compliance programs, laws, and standards, of course, FedRamp being one of them. There's also the payment card industry, which really seeks to protect sensitive cardholder data information. And then there's HIPAA, which is really focused on protecting kind of sensitive information in the healthcare industry. And you'll oftentimes see a lot of different kind of guiding frameworks or guiding sets of best practices. And the two ones we run into most often at Anchor are either the best practices that the Center for Internet Security publishes. So what they'll often do is kind of dive into a particular technology, a very specific one in the case of like Docker or in the case of Kubernetes, and say, okay, well, for your container orchestration infrastructure, here are some best practices to consider for that level of the stack. And same goes for kind of the container infrastructure. If you're just kind of using Docker, they kind of enumerate through a list of all these really good security controls to follow. And quite often we see this as a really great place to start. In the context of FedRamp, when we think about the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, or NIST, here's where we kind of see those guiding frameworks and principles kind of more focused. So NIST 800-190, which really seeks to create specific guidance around containerized applications, and then in the case of FedRamp, really following NIST 853, that's going to be the framework for that whole authorization process. Ultimately as well, FedRamp aligns kind of quite nicely with good supply chain best practices. And these are kind of 4 key ones we emphasize at Anchor quite often. We definitely promote anybody kind of building software to do it in an automated fashion through a very kind of centralized CI/CD process. Kind of at no point in time should you really not know how your software ended up in a live production environment. And it really should go through some kind of start gate and then end gate where there's a number of different quality controls in between. Secondly, really trying to build our container images from trusted sources. If we're going to settle on the fact that these images will be our distribution and deployment artifacts, knowing how they were actually built and assembled is really critical. So not just allowing any container image to be then instantiated as a container that came from some random source on the internet that we don't know. Again, just a good kind of hygiene and best practice to consider. And thirdly, really automating security testing into our CI/CD flow, right? And this isn't just kind of gathering a bunch of information through each stage, but really using a lot of these controls and quality gates that a lot of security tools enable us to say, okay, well, we failed our software composition analysis check, or we failed our container scanning check. Let's stop or at least pause the build right here and make sure these issues get addressed, and then kind of move them through and promote them to the next stage in our workflow. And then lastly, this kind of like sums it up really in the sense that really you should only be deploying kind of your trusted, hardened set of software applications into live production environments. And with that, we can kind of dive into how FedRamp controls apply to containers, and I will pass it off to Hayden.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. So hi, everyone. I'm Hayden. I'm a DevOps engineer with public sector. Previously worked as a third-party assessor for many years for a 3PAO. So happy to be here today and kind of explain some of the gray areas that really exist for FedRamp and how it applies to containers, right? So starting from the top, FedRamp is a big conglomeration of really these holistic NIST 853 controls and a ton of different controls from NIST itself. And a lot of times organizations, the first step they need to figure out is which controls apply to me. And a lot of times this goes through the control selection process. You're focused on determining the level of sensitivity of data that your organization is handling. And then from there, you're able to establish a baseline, right? And really fall in line with, okay, I need to follow FedRamp low, medium, and high. And that was awesome, right? For the world of virtual machines and typical cloud computing. And then you throw containers into the mix and really the security issues that containers provide, right? So then you start taking in, you start factoring that in, and FedRamp has come forward with very specific guidance now as it not only pertains to vulnerability scanning, but vulnerability scanning requirements specifically for containers. So a lot of these things we'll go over today are actually just basic information security best practice. So they're going to be things that everyone is familiar with here on the phone, right? So things like least privilege, right? That's an information security best practice. But now let's take that and apply it a level deeper to containers and make sure that containers are following, least privilege checks. What you're seeing here on the screen, that's a screenshot of AC610. It's basically a little screenshot, a little snippet of what Anchor can check for, right? Making sure we're following best practice to make sure a container image is built and created to execute as a non-privileged user. And that's really what AC610 talks about. And it's also something, as you see in that screenshot to the right, that's also something that is put out by another source, which is DISA. So DISA has issued really specific guidance where they've done a fantastic job mapping, okay, this is the control language that exists, and this is the container specific check that must be applied. And here's the traceability that maps all the way back to that specific NIST 853 control, which is commonly monitored for by third-party assessors within FedRamp. So we could take a look at what that actually looks like in practice on our next slide here. So if we move on, we could see what that looks like in Anchor, right? So Anchor has taken this guidance put out by both FedRamp, DISA, and various other NIST 800 publications, such as NIST 800-190, and put in place specific checks. So if you look at this screenshot here, just looking at the top right, we're looking for things like embedded credentials, secrets being left in Docker images, which happens more often than people would like to admit. But you would see that, right? And you could label this easily, right? Oh, I'm just checking for embedded credentials check. If you walked in as a third-party assessor, that'd be difficult to understand which NIST 853 control this really maps back to from that FedRamp auditor perspective. So Anchor has actually remediated that and provided that for that key stakeholder, right? So we have that mapping provided in our FedRamp policy, which is made available to all of our FedRamp customers. So we provide, the container specific check that we are doing to maintain, the confidentiality and integrity of that container, and the specific NIST 853 control that we're taking a look at there. So if we look at the next slide, we could kind of see what that looks like in the Anchor UI, right? So here I'm analyzing the latest Alpine image, right? And you can see in the top right that I have the Anchor FedRamp scanning policy in effect, and you could see automatically that Anchor is failing this image, for that. So if a developer is actually building this image in their native environment, they can see that, oh, I'm failing this specific control. Yeah, that's great, but honestly, a developer probably won't know what that means. But we give them the proper developer speak as well, so they know, okay, this is what I need to go remediate within that container. So here, right, it's saying, if we just look at the top line item, they're talking about finding a root user. Again, that's violating that concept of least privilege, which is directly tied to AC610. And you'll see a lot of subsequent checks there, that violate various other NIST 853 controls. But having that data available for FedRamp organizations is super valuable. One, because we're really empowering the developer to go back and be able to fix, adequate findings that we find from a compliance perspective as it relates to containers. And two, we're providing that data and making it readily available to those 3 PAOs, authorizing officials, so they have the proper reporting artifacts, throughout the pipeline, right? So we can, on every build, Anchor is doing this. So anytime an image gets analyzed by Anchor, you can, guarantee you're going to have the adequate reporting artifact generated for each container image, which is very, very important. And we could kind of take a look at how that would look on the next slide. And we'll focus on what I call the containers and compliance implementation model. So right here, A lot of times when we talk about adopting containers, because containers can be easily packaged, they're a great way to source applications and deploy them on Kubernetes and in the cloud, whatever cloud environment you choose, right? But it also, with that comes inherent risks that need to be, touched on and need to have control in place, right? So you need to have control in place to be able to mitigate that risk of moving a little bit quicker and still not compromising any facet of security. So this slide really does a good job at showing, how how the FedRamp stakeholders interact with each other. So moving from left to right, we have the development team. Maybe you have a developer that builds a container for a FedRamp CSP or a FedRamp organization. So they're packaging that application, they're shipping it. You have the DevOps team, right? They're automating those FedRamp policies into the DevOps tool chain. So like we saw on the previous slides, that's taking Anchor and embedding it within, your CI process, whether you're using Git CI or Jenkins, so that on every build, you're getting scanning, a compliance check, a total software bill of materials, and you're getting those policies and results generated continuously. And that goes back into feeding into, providing a good Kanban strategy, right? So you're doing that continuous scanning and providing continuous visibility into your containers. And then when you move into the operations side of the house, we're able to find and fix those FedRamp issues quicker, right? So we're not waiting, to get to the end where we're, ready to submit for a ATO package, and we're saying, oh, we should just go ahead and POAM, these findings. No, that's certainly not what we're doing. What we're doing is doubling down on security and embedding security at every step of the software delivery lifecycle, right? And by doing that, we're able to generate the artifacts necessary to remediate as many of those FedRamp compliance issues earlier on in the development lifecycle than what we would traditionally have seen in the past. And by doing that, you're really allowing for those artifacts to be consumed by both your security team and also your third-party assessors, right? So you're having that data that's readily available and stored for every single build of a container image. So you can show your third-party assessor, yes, I'm in line with FedRamp best practices, and I'm following the container security guidance that FedRamp PMO has published. And what that ends up in is a nice, rose-colored picture of that authorizing official signing off on that ATO package, because they have all the relevant data and all the relevant, points they need from the third-party assessor when it comes to making that decision, that is informed by, risk. So having touched on that, we're now going to discuss the 6 or 7 main points that FedRamp has published in their document. So I'm going to hand it back over to Jeremy, and he's going to dive into those.
Hey, before you go, Hayden, I've had a couple questions come in that I think would be helpful for you to answer now before we switch off. So one question is whether on the FedRamp we're highlighting ATO or PATO checks.
Yeah, so these checks could be used, for organizations going down that provisional ATO path, or organizations that are moving down that ATO, that full ATO process. So, I would encourage and advise either option. You should be incorporating these best practices to get your organization ready for that assessment.
Okay, great. And then I have a couple more for you. So one question was in one of those earlier slides, you were referencing some container controls. You had a couple documents that you included. What reference or what documents were those coming from?
Sure. So that first document was actually published before the FedRamp Container Security Guidance. So that was published by DISA. DISA did a fantastic job providing a lot of the mapping as it pertains to container security specific checks and mapping those back to the NIST 853 controls. That document is called the DISA Container Image Creation and Deployment Guide. So in that document, they will review, various container specific checks that are influenced by multiple NIST 853 and NIST 800-190 documents. So all of those are super key into factoring what you should be doing for your containers like workload. And then on top of that, right, like the FedRamp container security document that they just published on March 16th, and what we're going to review here in the next few slides, that document was also massively informed by NIST 800-190 and also, artifacts DISA has put out in the past.
Okay, great. And then one last question. It said, where can we get a copy of where the DISA standards link to the FedRamp or the control?
Yeah, so that's all available on the DISA cyber.mil website. So if you go to cyber.mil, you can actually I believe they have a DevSecOps section now. So you can go into that section, and the container image creation and deployment guide is in there. They also have a awesome DevSecOps reference architecture diagram and multiple other resources. I would encourage orgs to check out, because there are certainly some really good best practices in there that can be leveraged for FedRamp environments to make them a little bit more secure.
Okay, great. All right, thanks, Hayden. I'll let you go on to Jeremy. We do have a few more questions, but we'll save a few of those up for the end.
Great. Thank you, Hayden. Thank you, Kim. So yeah, now I'd like to actually transition to discussing the new FedRamp vulnerability scanning requirements for containers. And we'll step through these 6 in a little bit more detail. So the first one, hardened images. So the CSP must only utilize containers from images which have been hardened. And these hardening standards really should be in accordance with the relevant benchmark published by NIST. So those 2 kind of screens where Hayden took us through Anchor, a lot of these kind of tools and controls you saw in there are really great to kind of map back to this first one, which is hardened images. The next is the third-party authorizing official must validate the image hardening process. So not just focusing on the artifacts we're building, but really kind of focusing on the CI/CD process, any tools that we're using along the way. All this, again, must be validated as well. And then lastly, non-hardened images should not really be used within the authorization boundary, and that kind of just speaks for itself and goes back to kind of those good best practices we talked about at the beginning, where we really shouldn't be using anything we haven't hardened or kind of moved through our entire CI/CD flow. And a good example of this is securing containers for the U.S. Department of Defense. So within the DoD, there's an organization known as Platform One, and Platform One manages basically a container artifact repository known as Iron Bank. And its real objective is to take in software, whether it's open source software, whether it's software from a particular vendor, and move it through a DevSecOps pipeline, and to take it in as input, harden it, take it through an approval process, and then push it out to kind of a trusted container repository where it's ready for consumption. And all the tools along the way basically inspect these artifacts, conduct a little bit of hardening and enforcement controls, and that's all kind of part of the build and approval process within this pipeline. And here we can just get a quick look at the containers catalog, and these are kind of the 4 Anchor images within there. So Anchor is part of that DevSecOps pipeline that's hardening the container images along with some other tools. And in addition, we have to go through the same hardening process. So this is a quick look at that. Next, the container pipeline. So the CSP must leverage automated tools to build, test, and deploy containers into production. And these tools have to meet the FedRamp requirements as well. So whenever possible, really try to automate all of these stages for building, for security, for testing, and then deployment. Additionally, now that we're kind of dealing with the container ecosystem in the cloud native environment, there are also supporting artifacts that go into managing all of these container platforms and container workloads, whether that's defining configuration within Kubernetes YAML or something else, infrastructure as code. All these artifacts are part of our application and platform stack or infrastructure stack. So these also need to kind of be validated in addition to, they should be thought of as another part of meeting your FedRamp requirements, essentially. And then finally, CI/CD really should include mechanisms to restrict the deployment of containers that don't meet these requirements. So whether that's kind of right before deployment via some type of admission controller, or whether that's just using the existing mechanisms from the tools within a CI pipeline to just say, let's stop this container from being promoted to a registry because, again, it's failing some requirement that we've laid out. This is just kind of meant to illustrate that, in a sense, that the scanning requirements for container technologies, and specifically FedRamp, this whole authorization process and assessment that goes on, it's not meant to be kind of, fall into one category. Right now that we're building software in a very automated way, there are many different places where we plug in security checks, where we need to actually monitor whether it's the registry, whether it's actually what's going on within the cluster or runtime, or maybe it's all the way back at the developer level, where we just want to provide good tools and mechanisms and hooks in place where we can grab our security checks and information early prior to actually moving them to the other stages. And ultimately, what this really kind of provides is a good way for us to understand that security risks can enter in a variety of different places, right? We have our CI/CD toolchain itself. We have kind of things that can happen at runtime, whether it's a 0-day or whether it's just kind of a typo squatting or insider attack. There are a lot of different kind of avenues where an attacker could insert themselves and plant something malicious. So really understanding our whole end-to-end workflow and toolchain is critical to securing. And on the vulnerability scanning front, this is really important, just to kind of integrate this as best we can into our CI/CD process, and only really deploy anything to production that has kind of been scanned within the past 30 days. And that window starts as soon as we deploy that container. So as soon as that container gets instantiated, this is when our window begins, and anything falling outside of this should really never actually make its way into production. And then finally, the patching process is different. This is just kind of a characteristic and property of dealing with these new distribution and deployment artifacts of containers, where we're no longer kind of SSHing into a virtual machine and running some update on that live system. The flow here always should be, okay, we have an issue with the container that it's running. We need to rebuild this container image, push it all the way through our automated workflow, and then redeploy it as fixed. Just to kind of show within the Anchor UI how we kind of surface our vulnerability information, you can see that I've scanned this example image right here, and we return kind of each line item saying, okay, well, here's the CVE we found, the package type, whether it's a Red Hat package, whether it's a non-operating system package, is there a fix available, and then linking off to where it came from. Additionally, vulnerability scanning with Anchor allows us to distinguish between whether or not these particular vulnerabilities have come from the base image or whether this comes from the application side of the house. So you can kind of say, okay, well, do we need to dive into the platform engineering team or the folks that are kind of curating those base images, or do we need to kind of shift these security issues over toward the folks who actually brought in the development dependencies and whatnot? And with that, I will hand it over to Hayden.
Sweet, thank you. Here we go. Awesome. Okay, so now we're going to dive into kind of the second half of security requirements, right? So security sensors, this is something that FedRamp included within their guide, right? So 4 key points here. One, they may be deployed alongside production. So they're kind of broad in what really they mean in terms of like what asset you could deploy along production. It could be an agent, it could be a pod running in your cluster. But the main point here is that it needs to be able to inventory and assess the security posture of your images that are currently running in your Kubernetes clusters. It should be run with privileges to ensure full visibility. So we want to make sure, we can gather all the information we need, but also make sure that that security tool is running with the appropriate privileges. Nothing new there from the FedRamp perspective. So that goes into how you would configure most, of your other tools in your FedRamp environment and within your boundary. And if it is used, it should be deployed everywhere, right? So you should have this running within your CI/CD pipeline. Jeremy already spoke about that, alongside production. So we can take a look at what that really looks like with Anchor here. So Anchor has something to do just that, which is called Kai. So Kai is our runtime inventory tool. So we can look at what is actually running inside of our cluster. Kai operates as a pod within your Kubernetes cluster and interacts with the Kubernetes API to gather what images are running inside your cluster. So here we can see my Anchor Enterprise deployment that I'm running. So I can see the specific SHA and image digest of that image. So there you have that end-to-end traceability of, yes, this was scanned with my Anchor deployment, and yes, it is allowed. But thinking about that in reverse on how this information can be used, a little bit more proactively is if you see an image that isn't, scanned with Anchor, you could then update your Kubernetes and mission controller to block that image from being moved into production, which is something that Jeremy also talked about. And if you look in the bottom, you can see, if you stare really, really hard, you can see the little Kubernetes emblem that shows in the Anchor UI. Yeah, this was last seen within this cluster and in this namespace. And this is actually really tied to a point that we'll get into it towards the end of the presentation, which is asset management and inventory, which is very, very strictly tied to configuration management best practice. Registry monitoring. This is something, FedRamp was very, very heavy on. So if you look at the document, they're very intense about registry monitoring. It's something that's also talked about at length in section 3 of NIST 800-190. But there's these 3 main points that you really need to focus on, right? When taking into account, how do I do registry monitoring, and what does the tool that I select need to do in order to do this to the FedRamp standard. So 1, the container registry must be monitored per unique image. So we're taking a look not just at, all the, you got to be able to look at each image individually, right? And be able to detect unauthorized changes to each image individually. That's super important. And we'll get in on the next slide and kind of take a look at how we can do that with Anchor. We can ensure images that have not been scanned in the last 30 days are not actively deployed in production. This is something, right, that is really, really important. So you got to be able to make sure you're updating that block list, regularly. Make sure you're updating that emission controller to make sure, you're not going to be pushing these images that haven't been scanned in the last 30 days. A very important point there. And then third, this is more of a suggestion, but definitely something we encourage and we enable with Anchor, which is, the process may be managed by alarms or controls to prevent unauthorized deployment. So being able to generate the notifications that you need in order to automate that process. And that's very important if you're talking about tying in and really incorporating those security stakeholders and your developers to get them all on the same page. So registry scanning in practice, right? Here we have the regular Docker registry. I can see my Anchor Kai image that we previously looked at on the previous slides. And here you can see I have the repo, and within Anchor, you can turn on repo watch. So you can actually watch for changes being made to that specific repo within that specific registry. And then you could take it a bit deeper to meet that FedRamp compliance standard, where you can look at the image tags. So you can detect changes being made to each tag. You can see all the different tags that are pushed within that repo. And then you have the ability to drill down and see a little bit, deeper what the vulnerability compliance, findings were for that specific image. And all of that's available over the API too. So if you want to monitor, multiple registries, lots of orgs use multiple registries, Anchor certainly makes that possible. And then lastly, right, asset management and inventory reporting. This is very, very, how should I say this? It's very comprehensive, right? So it's very tightly coupled to the security sensors a requirement that we saw earlier. So they have a lot of stuff mentioned in the FedRamp document that's covered on this slide here. The 4 main points, right? It needs to have a unique asset identifier. So having that, SHA would be sufficient for each image because that's unique to that image. Being able to trace that end to end. So like we saw with the security sensor and Kai, we could see that, image digest, repo tag, where it came from, and be able to trace that back to Anchor and, generate alerts based on that. These image-based asset identifiers must be documented in the FedRamp integrated inventory workbook template. So within Anchor, we have the ability to export all that data that you saw, either in JSON or CSV format, which makes it very easy to copy over into the inventory workbook template. And this also actually ties into CM8, which is talked about in our third point. So CM8 talks about really providing holistic inventory on everything that's running within your authorization boundary. So, being able to track that and provide automation around that is super important. Anchor being an API first and API centric tool, that's really, easy to do. So we have a pretty robust reporting API that you could leverage to pull in all that data, super quickly in order to meet that control. And then 4 is every production deployed container must correspond to the image from which it originated in order to identify the total number of relevant vulnerabilities. So again, providing that FedRamp is super hyper concerned about providing that traceability as they should be, right? So Jeremy did an awesome job covering, the software supply chain, focus of FedRamp. So FedRamp is certainly focused on being able to trace, okay, this image was scanned with Anchor. Now I want to be able to make sure that's the same image that's running in my Kubernetes cluster. So Anchor definitely makes that so. And you also want to be able to report on the vulnerabilities of, everything you have running in your cluster. So that's exactly what I have up on the screen right now. So through our reporting service, this is, again, all automated. So you basically set this up once and you can, pretty much forget about it, right? So here I have it configured to kick off daily at noon. And what this is doing is pulling all my vulnerability severities in. So, total number of vulns across all my runtime images, and then it spits it back out in that report. And you can see there that it has from left to right, your vulnerability identifier, your runtime context. So it tells you what cluster it's running in, the namespace it's found in, the image digest, again, having that unique identifier. So seeing that unique identifier being run in that specific context, and then also having that total list of CVEs available for export and consumption into your FedRamp templates is very, very critical. All right, so that wraps up those key 6 points that are talked about in the FedRamp, vulnerability scanning requirements for containers. But now we get to the last point they make in the document, which is the transition plan. So the clock is ticking, right? They only have given us a month to provide a transition plan and 6 months from the release date of the document to transition into full compliance. So that puts us at September 16th, 2021. They do stipulate that if full implementation is not possible, you can work with your AO on a mitigation plan, right? Anchor is fully, we're here to fully support 3PAOs, cloud, service providers, our partners in the federal government to make this process and adjustment as easy as possible for organizations. So Anchor has actually developed a transition plan template for container security. So to help ease that burden, that will include, what controls we're going to be hitting, by, adopting Anchor and by adopting, a holistic security approach and how we can touch on each of these aspects that FedRamp has put out. So we'll make that template available to everyone on the call. So the 7 must-dos to expedite FedRamp containers, just to really wrap things up here. 1, we want to understand how standard controls apply to containers. 2, put validated container images into that private repo. talking about building off hardened images, build from what is trusted and what you've put time into securing. 3, this is something that we take to heart here at Anchor, which is shift left, right? So we want to start scanning for those FedRamp compliance issues super early on in the pipeline, and we want to remediate super early on because we don't want to have to deal with them later on in the software delivery lifecycle. 4, we need to implement continuous scanning in our registry, right? So this is actually aligning with continuous monitoring and vulnerability scanning best practices already put out by FedRamp, but now we're talking about applying it to registries. So making sure you're not pushing those containers into production that don't have a security scan within the last 30 days. Super important there. 5 is we need to start using automation. So when we start talking about monitoring what's in production, we really need an API-centric tool to make automation possible, right? Like the UI is not going to do that for you. The automation is there with the API to really help streamline all your pipeline workflows to make this as easy as possible. 6 is being able to match your containers being run in your production runtime environment with the unique asset identifiers. That was something that was hit on in multiple sections within the FedRamp document. So selecting a tool that can definitely do that is absolutely critical. And 7 is that we need to start. We need to start right now, actually. As we saw on the previous slide, that clock is already ticking. And again, that's why Anchor is so keen on enabling our partners and the 3PAOs, the CSPs and our federal orgs, and really making sure they have everything they need from us to make that process and transition as easy as possible. And now we can open it up for some Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you, Hayden. Thank you, Jeremy. So we have a number of questions coming in. So the first, we had a couple questions come in about the pricing on the Anchor offering. So I'll just answer that really quickly. And it was, what do you need to use like the FedRamp policies pack that we put together? So if you're already an Anchor user, there's an add-on option for either the enterprise version or the federal version. So whichever you are. So if you're like a software vendor and you have the enterprise version, you can add it onto that, or the same thing with the federal version. So reach out to your account manager on that. Then the next question I think is probably one for you, Hayden, which is how is the authorization boundary established via Anchor?
Yeah, that's a great question. So your authorization boundary is something that is actually determined, right, by both you and your 3PAO. So you have to determine that's one critical artifact in the FedRamp process is your information flow diagram, your network architecture diagrams. That's where you need to determine where your boundary actually is. How Anchor interacts with your authorization boundary is something that is definitely applicable, right? So Anchor we don't exist as a SaaS solution, right? So Anchor, we provide our software to be deployed, in whichever cloud environment that your organization is operating in. So we can live within that authorization boundary. So that way you don't have to, declare or fix anything in your SSP that would say, I have another external connection that flows out to Anchor Cloud or anything like that. No, that's not how we operate. So all your vulnerability data that's generated within Anchor, all your compliance findings that's generated within Anchor can all live within that authorization boundary without having any external connection out.
Okay, great. And I'm going to have a couple more questions, but I do want to point out here that if you guys are interested in a FedRamp consultation or a demo, you can reach out at info.anchor.com/contact. The consultation, you kind of get Hayden in a box, Hayden one-on-one time. So if you want that, feel free to fill out that form and we'll get in contact with you. All right, a couple more questions I have coming in. Regarding vulnerability scanner, does Anchor roll up like solution CVEs by package and report them as a singular finding?
Jeremy, do you want to, or do you want me to take that one? So, Anchor, can you repeat the question, Kim? Was it?
Regarding vulnerability scanning, does Anchor roll up like solution CVEs by package and report them as a singular finding?
Yeah, so we match based on the CVE is matched to that package that we find whenever we're doing that SBOM generation. So, the SBOM is a central focus of what Anchor does in terms of generating a complete, in total software bill of materials. So we're pulling in, all those dependencies and bill packages that you need for that application to function. From whatever we find in there, we'll match the applicable CVE that is matched to that specific package. So I'm not sure what they mean by rolling up, but maybe
we can follow up.
There's a different take on the roll up thing.
Yeah, Jerry, do you want to touch on, because I think one thing that maybe this is touching on is how do you avoid false positives or kind of redundancy in vulnerabilities so you're not inundated by too much information? Is that something, Jeremy, you want to touch on briefly?
Yeah, sure. So I can talk a little bit about what Hayden said in a bit more detail. So essentially what happens is the very first thing that Anchor is going to do when we go about inspecting a container image artifact is we try to generate that software bill of materials. So basically we try to be very context aware in the sense that we're dealing with a container image. It's not just lists of packages and we're kind of done with it. But what happens during the analysis process is Anchor will go through and basically catalog everything that it finds within that artifact. So you can take, for example, an image that's based off Red Hat with some application dependencies added on. What Anchor is going to do is say, okay, well, here's a bunch of operating system packages that we found. We're going to put them in one place. Here's a bunch of node modules we found. We're going to put them in another place. And it's all going to kind of make up this entire SBOM. And this SBOM is actually what the vulnerability portion of the Anchor technology then uses to determine vulnerability matches potentially. And what happens on the false positive side quite often is we'll see kind of tons of vulnerabilities being thrown back by lots of other tools that aren't really being too aware of exactly what is in the software bill of materials, if that makes any sense. So what Anchor tries to do is when we actually identify that there is a Red Hat base image for this, is we try to then use the source of truth, which is the Red Hat CVE database for those operating system package matches. NVD in this context would be a third party in the sense that you'll probably get a lot more CVEs returned back if we also were to use NVD to match on these operating system packages for Red Hat. So we try to be very sensitive to the fact that from a false positive perspective, if we can kind of be opinionated on the fact that, oh, we understand that this is Ubuntu or this is Red Hat, you probably are going to be more interested in the quality of the vulnerability information from the vendor itself than the third party that could be NVD or somewhere else. So that's one mechanism that we use, and you'll probably see that quite obviously when you actually run an Anchor scan, is that we're going to use the vendor as that source of truth for the OS package matches, and we found that that's been quite useful so far. We've also kind of created some tools within the technology itself to assist with just vulnerabilities and false positives in general. I think it's definitely something that is just commonplace and it's going to happen. So having a way to say, okay, well, let's actually correct this false positive that has been returned. And there are a number of different ways we can do that within Anchor, whether it's within a false positive management system that we have, so kind of like correcting the CPE match so we can kind of get the right match back surfaced in the UI from the API, or kind of tuning the analyzers, right? So what actually Anchor does during the analysis process when it's creating that SBOM, you can kind of instruct that analyzer and guide it towards kind of the right choice if you know what's in your container images. So those are just a couple of things that can kind of help with that.
We have one more or a couple more questions, but one question, does Anchor support hardening images in accordance with relevant benchmarks listed in the National Checklist Program and defined by NIST SP 870?
Yes, so you can incorporate a lot of benchmarks that you see out there for, into policy for Anchor, and then be able to enforce. And if that's, what you're using for hardening, then you can create an Anchor policy to make that so. So we have different organizations that have different hardening policies out there. Some are FedRamp, some are DoD, and they have custom policies that are able to be mapped onto their specific images and enforced. So you get that holistic kind of compliance baseline established for all of your containers.
And then I think we got one final question. Do you offer, maintain an operator for OpenShift?
I believe we do have a operator for OpenShift.
Yes, we do. So just kind of for some more context, we deploy and we deliver Anchor as a container image. So any one of our customers or users is able to run Anchor as a container on whatever orchestration platform that they have. So we primarily maintain our Helm chart as kind of a common mechanism for deploying the Anchor software, but we also kind of have included that as part of the operator within OpenShift. So both of those are supported, and Anchor itself will run anywhere you can run containers.
All right, so with that, let's wrap it up. So a couple just reminders, look for an email with the link to the recording today or tomorrow, I believe. Within the next 24 hours, you should get that. We will also follow up with an email with the transition plan template that Hayden spoke about. So look for that. That'll probably come in a separate email because I don't think we'll have it when this follow-up goes out ready to go. And then use this URL if you would like to, learn more, talk to us a little bit more, or get a demonstration or answer additional questions. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining.